and wrote about those issues, taught about those issues, researched those issues. In 1989, Professor Leroy Littlebear, the chair of the Native American Studies Department here in Lethbridge, at the University of Lethbridge, gave me a call and invited me to apply for a job here in Lethbridge, Alberta. I applied. I went through the process. I got the job. I became the history guy in Native American Studies. This is in 1990. And here it is 2017, and I'm still here.
Right on, right on. So you, in theory, you know a lot about the history of Native America.
I've written books about it. I came to translate this into a kind of look at colonization of indigenous peoples, well, in North America. Well, what about the Western Hemisphere? I kind of broadened it out. Then I started to look at Africa and say colonization happened there. There were indigenous peoples there. You have a more complex situation in the Middle East, in Eurasia, but certainly colonization has happened there. Britain colonizing China. Hong Kong was created on that basis. So little by little, the subject opened up of indigenous peoples in encounter with empires, with imperial powers, with missionaries, with corporations seeking to own and develop resources, settlers coming in from far and wide into this area, for instance, and taking over the land. This is an interesting process. Along the way, treaties were made. Sometimes genocidal wars happened. Sometimes European powers sided with one Indian group over another Indian group. It turned out to be a huge, a huge and fascinating subject. And so I, at one point around 2000, started to call it globalization studies. And that became the basis for these two big books in the Bowl with One Spoon series, The American Empire in the Fourth World and Earth into Property. And so I've been doing globalization studies within the Liberal Education Unit at the University of Lethbridge.
Okay, so just thinking a little bit more about the history of specifically Native Americans in North America, even going back a little further than when European colonization happened, in theory, the original Native American population must have come here at some point somehow. What are there any predominant theories on how they originally got here?
Well, of course, that would be a big subject in, say, Introduction to Native American Studies. And there's a huge literature saying it involved the Bering Land Bridge, that during a prior ice age, this Bering Strait was a land bridge. People migrated over that land bridge. But then there was obviously a controversy aroused by that sort of anthropologist, archaeologist interpretation of who people are. Indigenous peoples in the Americas, like peoples all around the world, they have their own religious, spiritual traditions. There are stories of the founding, the creator of the universe intervening and creating human beings and blowing life into different creatures. Napi, the old man, he did this. We're close to the Old Man River, the river of Napi. And we are Napiquan, interestingly, the non-Indians. We somehow have a name that in the Blackfoot language that is connected to Napi. So one has to be comprehensive, I guess, open-minded to consider that some people are religious. They believe in Adam and Eve. Darwin would say no. Darwin has a theory. Some people don't accept Darwin. To this day, people are entitled to have their own, embrace their own religious traditions and heritages as they see fit. Some people take these accounts of how the world was created, Adam and Eve, the apple of sin, all of these stories. Some people take that quite literally. So in looking at indigenous peoples in the Americas, it's important to bear in mind that some people take these stories as true, and
absolutely.
And I find myself at times finding these ancient stories, these stories about the genesis of life on the planet, quite compelling from Native people, and do adhere to some of those beliefs myself.
Now, I was born in Lethbridge, and just now you taught me something that I never knew about the Oldman River and Napi. Oldman River, Napi. Is there any other possibly interesting tidbits of information or factual things about Lethbridge specifically and the Native American? I mean, there's a huge culture around here for sure, but what do you think you could maybe impart to the listeners that they may not know?
Well, local people might care about these things. Interestingly, the Oldman River, which is, say, half a mile away from us here, where we're sitting now, that used to be referred to as the Belly River in the early 1900s, in the early 20th century. It was the Belly River. Then some member of the royal family came here, and it was thought, oh, that's a bit lewd, you know, it's a bit like having a river named after a body part. Interestingly, the body part was part of a larger construction, like Nose Hill Park. You've heard of Nose Hill Park in Calgary.
Yeah.
You know, the knee is referred to, that there's different place names connected to body parts of the old man.
Okay.
And Stanley Knowlton, I remember telling me about this. So there's the Belly Buttes on the Blackfoot Reserve, and the Belly River. And so the name, the Belly, was changed in 1907 or something in order to make a member of the royal family who was visiting more, you know, comfortable, because you wouldn't want to have a body part, you know, exposed to the royal family. So
that is I believe it was 1906 to 1909 that the viaduct was made. So, like, the high-level bridge. So that would have been the exact same time they were making the bridge across the river that they also renamed the river they were building a bridge across.
And it would make sense, because that bridge, that high-level bridge, is an amazing engineering project. When you think about it, in the early 20th century, it's a major, famous monument of the British Empire. And after all, building installations like that at that time were the way that the British Empire was saying, no, we're keeping the northern part of North America. We're not going to just abandon it, like was happening when the Fort Whoop-Up was built and the American whiskey traders were coming into this area. No, the British Empire decided to keep the northern part of North America by building the Canadian Pacific Railway, and that bridge is an amazing manifestation of engineering prowess for its era. And it's, you know, how this place came to be on the map.
It's actually endured right into this century. To this day, it is the largest railway structure in Canada, and it is the largest of its type in the world.
Yeah, whatever its type means.
Yeah.
Actually, I was watching this Costa Bravo movie. It's often photographed. It was a film about white supremacists and militias in this part of the world. And we're close to Idaho here, we're close to Montana here. And there was a scene where the main character was driving along to the racist rally. And I looked in the background, and there was that bridge, that high-level bridge.
Oh yeah, right.
Which is a kind of landmark of this part of the world in this famous movie. Of course, this is a coal mining town, coal banks, and of course, the creation and building up of the University of Lethbridge starting in 1967. This has been a huge contribution to Lethbridge's history. And, you know, I've been here for 27 years. This is the 50th anniversary of the University of Lethbridge. So I've been here over half of those 50 years. And I really threw myself into work here, into the sort of mission of Native American studies. I got very involved in, you know, the constitutional matters, the Meech Lake Accord. My study was treaties and land issues, land title issues. I taught courses in it. We traveled to many different events, and it's been, in many ways, a very good base for me to do some important things.
Over the course of 26, 27 years, studying specifically Native American studies and treaty matters and things like that, I'm positive you must have encountered some issues or controversy at some point or another. What are some of the possibly more memorable times that you can recall where you've used your experience as Native American professors?
Well, for sure, when I first arrived here, the Old Man Dam was just getting to the point of completion. And the Old Man Dam is built about 30, 40 miles from here. It's an irrigation dam, particularly. And anyway, its construction was controversial. And immediately I looked at it and I thought, well, it's all being done under provincial auspices. In Canada, we have two levels of government. We're a federal state. We have the central government, the federal government, and the provincial government. The federal government has certain powers. Provincial government has certain powers. That you could not do an installation like that, the Old Man Dam, exclusively on provincial powers. Now, this may seem technical, but it became very controversial and very high profile here in Lethbridge because a group called the Lone Fighters, led by a person called Milton Bourne with a Tooth, they took a stand during the summer of 1990 when there was a confrontation in or near Montreal at Oka over land title and such. And Milton Bourne with a Tooth traveled to Oka. He came back, and when RCMP came on to what was then a building site, the Lone Fighters had taken, they got access to and control of a bulldozer, which they then proceeded to dig a ditch around the irrigation weir, the installation that puts water into the Lethbridge North Irrigation District, which feeds all the Feedlot Alley in Twin Buttes and such. That's the huge business around here, raising cattle on feedlots.
Beef, Alberta beef, man.
Yeah, this is our. So that was a very provocative act, and that provocative act was taken on the assertion that the Old Man Dam was not legal, that it was a violation of the pagan people's spiritual traditions. They get certain plants out of the river, that there's biological diversity in the riverbed. Anyway, I joined into this project. I was new. I was in Native American Studies. Of course I'm going to be drawn to this matter.
Makes sense.
And Milton Bourne with the Tooth, when the RCMP came to shut down this bulldozer operation, he fired what he says was 2 warning shots. And suddenly there was more or less a military confrontation at the Old Man River Dam. I was there at the time. Nelson Smallage Jr.'s son, he said, non-Indians go out and sit on the most contested area, the berm. I sat on the berm one afternoon, RCMP helicopter, 6 feet over my head, and simply sitting there, and then I could look across the way and see soldiers, well, they are actually RCMP, in the bush, in camouflage gear, with various kinds of submachine guns and that kind of thing. It was pretty weird. Anyway, a judge that afternoon handed down some kind of ruling. Suddenly, everybody came out of the bush, and the sort of standoff eased up, and so then the Lone Fighters, some of them went into hiding. There was some kind of legal document that they should be picked up or questioned. Anyway, one of the things we did was to go in to Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump Interpretive Center, which is just a couple of miles away, and interpret what had been happening. And from my perspective as a Native American Studies prof, I was very aware when the Olympics were happening in 1988, the Winter Olympics in Calgary. The Glenbow Museum had a show showing Indian artifacts largely gathered in Europe. And there was a call for a boycott of that show with the view that, hey, showing Indian heritage and tradition by, say, Petro-Canada or Shell, these are companies that are violating Indigenous people's heritage and traditions these days, right now.
It's a bit of a cognitive dissonance there.
Yeah, so for that particular type of agency, oil company, to be showing off the cultural heritage of Indian people, which is a wonderful thing to do, but nevertheless, should it be them doing it? And so this boycott of saying, we want to show off the Indian heritage of our province of Alberta in the past. But what about the president? And what about the reality? How are Native people situated now
right
in
now,
society? And if they're being cut off from access to their traditional culture, as this dam arguably was doing, or the exploitation of the Lubicon lands, for instance, who were quite in the bush and having a traditional hunting and fishing life, maintaining their traditional heritage. If industrialization is severing that, that's a serious issue. So when I went into Head Smash in Buffalo Jump, and along with others gave uninvited speeches, that's what I talked about. I was subsequently, a week later, charged with speaking too loud in a public place. So Milton Bourne with the Tooth was charged with the 2 shots that he set off. I was charged with words that came out of my mouth.
Making noise?
Making intelligible noise. So theoretically this trial was supposed to be about the tone of my voice when I had given my talk at Head Smashed in Buffalo Jump, but I couldn't help to feel maybe it had something to do with what I was saying.
Possibly the words you're using in the sentence structure and the verbiages, and they could maybe be getting an impression from it, Maybe they're listening.
And Aboriginal matters are very contentious in this area.
They are huge issues. I mean, we have a huge Native American population, and they have very specific desires that are not unreasonable, but they are definitely opposing to a lot of corporate views, which can create some dynamics which are a little bit more tricky to maneuver around for sure. Things like, pipelines.
Mm-hmm.
Pipelines. Oil companies need pipelines. Pipelines go across land. Yeah, that's an issue.
Yeah. And for instance, in British Columbia, they do not have Indian treaties. There is in this area Treaty Number 7. In northern, farther north in Alberta, there's Treaty Number 6. Farther north yet, there's Treaty Number 8. So there is some kind of deal about the land, but where these pipelines are pointed in British Columbia, there never was a basic transaction on the Indian title with the First Nations. So these are the kind of things that, were my professional métier and continue to some extent to be my professional métier. Yeah.
So for people who aren't specifically aware, what exactly do those treaties accomplish in Alberta that we do not currently have in BC?
The treaties sort of start in what we now call Southern Ontario after the American, actually the Royal Proclamation of 1763, where the interior of North America was reserved as an Indian hunting ground. I take this to be a major stimulant, impetus for the American Revolution, what we now call the American Revolution, which was actually a civil war within the British Empire, where there was a secessionist group, and they said, we don't want to be governed by these rules about having to obtain Indian consent for westward expansion into the interior. This, of course, came after New France was no more. There was a place called Canada once, it was under French governance. It's called New France. Sometimes it was called Canada. Suddenly the British, through military conquest, were governing Canada. How would they govern Canada? They would govern it through the fur trade. This Royal Proclamation was connected to giving an advantage to the Montreal industries. So this is, I'm actually abbreviating a very short. But after the United States comes out of this revolutionary experience, the secessionist movement, the idea that you have to deal with the Indian people. And actually, they can be important as allies in military contexts.
They should be working together to accomplish mutual goals.
Yeah, and we can do the fur trade together. And so treaties were made in southern Ontario. Treaties were made in a mining frontier when mining was opened up north of the Great Lakes. And when the preparation was to do all the transactions necessary to build the Canadian Pacific Railway, essentially to transform the Hudson's Bay Company into the Canadian Pacific Railway Company, which would involve privatizing lands, which would involve the railway company owning lands, which would involve the railway company encouraging people to come and settle in this area and get private title to land. What about the Indian people? So the rules had developed within the British Empire that Well, you have to get consent. According to this royal proclamation, you have to get consent from Indian people. Pacific and the Atlantic or the Arctic Ocean. And so that's where the treaties ended, just about 100 miles from here. So British Columbia was a distinct history. It was a colony. And so it started as a colony basically in response to the California gold rush being kind of transferred northward when gold was discovered in the Fraser Valley, and then British Columbia was created and it developed its own Indian policy, which didn't include the recognition of Indian title.
Now, if I remember my history right, when we were making the railways, there's two competing companies coming from opposite ends of the country. One that started on the west and one started on the east, and they essentially met around the Rocky area. Do you think that would have or would have been affected at all by those treaties not being in effect in BC but being in effect in everywhere else?
Well, it wasn't two companies, it was different initiatives on behalf of the same company, Canadian Pacific Railway. But in terms of two companies, the Canadian Pacific Railway was essentially the Conservative Party, John A. Macdonald's method of distributing a lot of patronage. For instance, where's the railway going to be located? Whoever has land where the railway is going to have some kind of junction is going to strike it rich, right? I mean, there's all kinds of favors you can do by building these railways to your political friends. So the Liberals developed what became the Canadian National Railway. So we have two railway lines, which actually, there are two big companies. Canadian Pacific Railway Company, from its inception, was a supposedly private company, although it was very closely connected to the government. But the Liberal Party's CNN was a Crown corporation.
All right. Now, you briefly touched on this, and I had an idea pop into my head that I might as well ask, because you probably would know. Back in the 1700s, I believe you said, the French occupied Canada, and it was French Canada, New France. At the time, the official language was changed to French, wasn't it?
Well, I would say that New French colonial entity, through a collaboration, it was Aboriginal people and the people who called themselves Canadiens, who were the founders of the original Canada.
Les Canadiens, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, this is the people who immigrated from France, and there was only about 10,000 of them.
Not many.
And they were Roman Catholic, and there wasn't really so much emphasis on the language in legal terms. It was about their religion, and there were obstacles for Roman Catholics holding office in the British system, for instance. So special provisions were made, changes were made to incorporate the Canada of New France, the fur trade entity, into the British Empire to recognize and acknowledge Roman Catholic rights. And also, I would argue, Aboriginal rights through this Royal Proclamation of 1763, which I think can easily be connected to the Quebec Act of 1774, which recognizes, the Catholic rights, and with it the language rights that after the conquest of New France by Britain, they created this new entity called Quebec. And Quebec had special recognition for the French-speaking population and was basically designed to accommodate the French-speaking population. And this has given Canada its special nature as a kind of bilingual entity ever since.
I think it's really, really important to recognize that the French language in Canada was given distinct, it was recognized as the Canadian language. I'm not sure that English was ever given that distinction. In Canada, it just so happens that we speak it, but if you actually were to look, I believe French was the only one that was actually given the distinction of a language.
Oh no, I mean there is an official status for the English language. I mean, Parliament was created according to the model of the Parliament in Great Britain. And so, you've had this model of the two founding peoples. And to me, this is where I sort of entered the picture and said, no, we're not two founding peoples. The Aboriginal peoples are also founding peoples. They have a just as the French-Canadian population centered in Quebec might make certain claims, well, we were here first, we were here before other settlers came, so
our settlers too.
We should have some kind of special status because of that. Well, yes, but what about the Aboriginal people? So, for instance, the Meech Lake Accord was framed in terms of recognizing two founding peoples, two linguistic groups, and that's why, to me, this was unacceptable. And I put a great deal of effort over a 3-year period into stopping the Meech Lake Accord. When I first arrived here, I was sort of at the end of that 3-year process, but I went down to Winnipeg when Elijah Harper sort of adopted it. I think I can fairly say arguments that I had been making, because we have talked about it all. He held up his feather in the Manitoba legislature, and they didn't get unanimous provincial support for the Meech Lake Accord in 1990. So that was a kind of auspicious beginning to working here in Native American Studies, to have been part of the making of this history. And it seemed to me that it was really out of line, that the Old Man Dam, something about it was really out of line, and it was essentially that the federal government has a special responsibility for lands and lands reserved for Indians. The federal government also has a special responsibility for fish and Indians. Fish and Indians are involved in that dam, and that was the point I was trying to make. And eventually the court did intervene. They did say, yes, the dam lacks a federal environmental assessment. Federal environment assessment was ordered. It happened. This is after I was, an effort was made to criminalize me for basically speaking about these issues in an uninvited talk at the Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump. It really was an instruction, though. It really was an indication, boy, the Indian Wars are sort of still on here. There is a certain heavy-handed force that comes into being when you raise these issues, these basic issues of natural resources, and you raise the issue of water, and who is responsible for water, and how it's
controls a basic resource like that. You're going to get some people that are contentious about it.
Yeah.
Now, just going a little bit further into Native American studies, because I'm sure there's people that are quite interested in that, and you have a wealth of knowledge. There's some people may be under the impression that Native Americans, that is a group, and that is the whole group. That is not the case. It is broken up into many, 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 many subgroups.
Well, you have like 53 languages spoken among Indigenous peoples in Canada. You have a huge kind of ethnic separation between the Eskimos and the Indians. Very, very different histories, heritages. And then you have colonization. You have the reality that there are Roman Catholic Indians, there are Mormon Indians, there are different types of Protestant Indians, which used to make a big deal in the 1800s. That was an issue. And there are Indian people have politics. They have different ways of looking at issues. For instance, the group that the lone fighters who were fighting the Old Man Dam, they were not universally embraced by all the Piegan people, so they were seen as a faction, not speaking for the majority in some circles. And to me, this has been a very interesting part of Native American studies, that it's one thing to look at the colonization of, could I say, the dominant society towards the repressed society, but within the repressed society, there are all kinds of class structures and interests involved, and it becomes, I think, challenging to open up that subject of the divisions and tensions and political antagonisms within Indian country, and that becomes a fraught subject to discuss.
It's a difficult subject to learn about, I've found, because to get the necessary insight and information, you have to speak to so many different specific subsets of people, and you have to intimately understand what their principal original goals are and what their founding, collective ideals are, and then you have to identify what the differences between them are. Now, in this area in southern Alberta, what different, types of Native American are there? What do we classify here?
Well, as you're looking at this subject and raising it my memory goes back to the years when I was doing the introductory class, Introduction to Native American Studies. And in those years there was a business management initiative directed at Native people. And so there were Native people coming, Cree people say, or Ojibwe people, Saulteaux people coming from Manitoba or from the Northwest Territories. There are Kootenai people coming from British Columbia, occasionally an Inuit person coming, and of course giving the introduction to Native American studies, you better be a little bit careful to see that all the groups who are in the class represented see something of their own heritage expressed. So Blackfoot people, of course, you know, that starts there. I mean, we're in Blackfoot country, so there is that heritage, but then there are other Native people's heritage. And let's remember that the majority of the people in such a class were not Native people. They're non-Native people, but that non-Native people, that constituency is not a uniform. So, you know, there are Mormons, there are Victory Church people, there are, you know, communists or agnostics, or you know, all kinds of maybe Quakers who are pacifists. You know, that it was quite interesting to, and kind of quite political, to try to present an interpretation that would be acceptable to a lot of people, that people wouldn't feel, and you don't want people to feel, oh, I'm just being guilt tripped here. Oh, this guy just wants to, you know, blame the white man for everything, and you know, no, you know, people have taken the class. That in itself has to be embraced and recognized, that they're, you know, giving a hearing to this subject, and this became for me important, not to just fall back on stereotypes about the good this or the bad that history tends to be complex, and, you know, even the dominant aggressive society, which was performing, arguably continues to perform kind of genocidal incursions on the indigenous peoples. But even in that society, you have enlightened individuals who come forward from time to time and say, this is not fair. You know, we should make treaties, for instance. Like, the whole heritage of treaties is in itself, to me, conveying an idea that, well, there should be some talk, there should be some negotiation. Yes, we have it in our power just to blow these people away, just to eliminate them, but we shouldn't do that. And it does make for a different history than in the United States, where in 1871 they actually passed a law on no more treaties, just as our number treaties in Canada were about to be made. So that you know, compare and contrast between the United States and Canada and its treatment of First Nations is interesting. Mind you, in the 20th century, the U.S. had a very enlightened person come into head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, John Collier, with the Indian New Deal. And there's nothing like that in Canada. The Indian New Deal said, no, we don't want to see Indian people be assimilated, disappear into the overall mix, whereas that has been the history in Canada, this assimilation. That's what the boarding schools are for.
Absolutely. I mean, the school issues, there's tons of school issues, but I mean, even comparing the U.S. to Canada, it's the huge, you know, patch quilt versus melting pot. We try to definitely support the patch quilt kind of arrangement, and even looking at that, even looking at the dominant culture, European colonization, we even have subcultures within the colonizing people, you know, the Hutterites and the Mennonites and the whatever else that have formed their own, well, not formed, but they have their own subcultures that are all equally represented in this geographic area, and they all have their very distinct parts to play. But I mean, it's just got to be an incredible amount of information to get out in a 40-minute talk here. Either way, what do you think about taking a break?
Okay. I think we have a certain objective with this discussion that we haven't even broached.
We have not even come close. Yeah. But we're going to have to start thinking about where we're going to go here.
Yeah, but I appreciate being able to speak about these points. I miss it. Like, this, you know, I put a lot of work over the years into
it's been
understanding
your entire career has been devoted to understanding this type of stuff, and I'm sure honestly, I'm sure there's plenty of people out there that are learning just a ton of information about this right now. But again, that's probably not why most people are interested at the moment in what's necessarily going on, because, well, what is there anything substantially changing at the moment, or very super like tangibly? What's the most pertinent issue going on right now with relation to the with the
I'm gonna put it all on my plate too.
Well, hey, I could direct this however I'd like. But,
Yeah, I understand. Just so I'm clear here, are we going to take a break? There was some mention of a break, and then come back and address this, or
that
should
is a
we
great
go
idea.
into
Why don't we give them a little bit of a sampling of what we're going to come back with? We'll give them a 30-second introduction. We'll give them 30 seconds to go. And what are we going to talk about when we come back from the break here?
Well, I'm not sure I can really do justice to it in 30 seconds, but maybe 1 minute. On October the 4th, 2016, I was suspended from the University of Lethbridge, meaning that I was teaching a class at the time. The university president, Dr. Mike Mann, wrote a letter saying, you're out of the classroom, you're suspended, your pay is cut to 0, you can't come on campus. I have reports that you are a very bad person. You, for instance, have addressed the connection between Israel and 9/11. And things have appeared on your Facebook post that are very unsavory. And rather than investigate this and go through the proper procedures, I'm just going to snap my finger and say, you're out.
So we're going to talk about some events that happened in August, that with relation to the University of Lethbridge and Israel, and your position there. Should be a very interesting topic. It sounds like we've got a lot of interesting and very, very extensive things to talk about, which will be very interesting when we come back. So you should definitely stay around and listen to some music on jessfm.ca. My name is Thomas James Morales Carpenter. Again, this is Dr. Anthony Hall that is joining us live, and we are going to just take a quick break here. We're going to throw on some more music. It's going to be me singing again, and you can like it or not, but it's still going to be me. And we are going to listen to Royals. And with that, we'll see you in a minute.